Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today's call. This is Diane. We have, as always, we have a large call. We have looks like we have about 1,000 people registered. We have about 300 people on the line so far. So I'm going to give it a couple minutes to give more people a chance to get on before we start the agenda. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining the call. I'm going to give it about one more minute before we get started, just to give a chance for a few more people to join. Okay, hi everybody. This is Diane Yantel. I'm President and CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Thanks for joining today's call on coronavirus, disasters, housing, and homelessness. Really appreciate everybody joining. I hope everybody who's joining from the Midwest or Texas or much of the country that is freezing and without heat is doing okay and staying warm and safe. We're certainly keeping everybody in our thoughts. And I usually give a number of updates at the top of the call, and I have several, but I'm actually going to hold on to them until we get to a later agenda item on the eviction moratorium and emergency rental assistance, because that's what all of my updates are about. And so instead, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, which is Jen Loving. She's from San Jose, California. She leads Destination Home, and Jen has just throughout the pandemic shown just really tremendous leadership, tenacity, creativity, worked incredibly hard, she and her entire team, throughout the pandemic to keep extremely low-income renters and people who are homeless healthy and safe and alive and housed during the pandemic. And now I'm really glad to have her on the call today to talk about some really innovative work and important work that she's done on a community-driven equity approach for emergency rental assistance, and doing all that she can to ensure that those emergency rental assistance funds get to the lowest income and most marginalized people. So Jen, thanks so much for your leadership, and thanks for joining today's call.
Hey, Diane, thanks for having us and letting me talk about what we're doing out here in California. If we can go to the next slide. So it's important, I think, to start with the problem that you're trying to solve. Our problem is that we already have 2 to 3 people becoming homeless every single month over how many people exit homelessness in Silicon Valley. We've housed about 16,000 people permanently in the last 5 years, but we have people coming in behind them at a rate that is disproportionate. And so we have a homelessness prevention system that we've been using for about 3 years pre-pandemic. And so when in March, we became one of the first communities in the nation to go into shelter in place. And we knew, based on the work of our homelessness prevention system, that we were going to be in a lot of trouble. And based on the data that we already had, we knew that this would disproportionately affect most vulnerable households, 30% AMI and below. So we did two things. We started to raise as much money as we can, and we worked with our local city and county to do eviction moratoriums. And I think San Jose was the first to do an eviction moratorium in the nation because of this really quick head start that we decided to take on trying to address what the vulnerability that we knew would be coming. So I'll walk through how we did it, but we ended up partnering with almost 70 organizations and community groups to reach vulnerable families. And we've served, by now, this is data as of end of December, over 14,000 families, distributing $31 million so far. Next slide. So how did we do it? So at the beginning, pre-stimulus, we decided to mimic our existing homelessness prevention system that, based on our assessment, and was serving about 85% ELI households, about maybe 3 or 4% up to 80% AMI. So we began in that same model, one-time cash payments with a broader AMI range, and we were oversubscribed within days. In total, we've had over, I think, 40,000 calls for help. Our budget in February, a year ago, was to serve 2,000 families this year. So stimulus passed. It helped us understand who was not going to be helped in those early stages of undocumented households and folks that were not eligible for unemployment. And so we really chose to narrow our eligibility. And how we did that was we entered into community with our Office of Racial Equity here in the city of San Jose. We had dozens and dozens of community partners around the table, and they helped us survey over 300 households that would be eligible for direct cash assistance. And they told us a few things. One, they wanted to get the money from people that they trusted in community, in their community, that they thought they needed $1,000, $500 to $1,000 at that time to get through what they were facing, and that they wanted to work with people that they trusted. And not everyone was banked or even banked at all in the same way. So we listened to the community, and we rolled out a pretty basic cash assistance where we made very flexible money in a multiple amount of ways available. But then when the state of California passed its eviction legislation, the first go around, we quickly turned to doing as much as we can to prioritize and pay the rent for the families in the extremely low income category that otherwise would not be able to get out of the situation that we're in. In California, we have to pay 25% of the back rent at that time through January 31st to be made whole. Cannot be legally evicted at that point, but it can turn into civil debt. So we partnered with dozens and dozens of agencies who did one-on-one work. Again, the priority was serving extremely low-income households and below. In fact, we started at like 10% AMI and used our partners who are the ones that are already in relationship with families to serve them. So if you go to the next slide, how did that work out? So we ended up all the way through 94% of the households that we served were households identifying as families of color. 77% were extremely low income. And that, again, is because the initial push wasn't focused on ELI, but we have been ever since. And then without trying, because of this being an equity model and listening to community, a third of the funding went into the highest COVID impacted zip codes in our community. And that was really important to see that if you're targeting where people are most financially at risk, that happened to also be where they were most at risk from a public health perspective. So the next slide, a little bit more about what we learned. As I think, Diane, you say every week, the ELI households saw their income drop by almost 2/3. The average household didn't owe that much money. $5,000 on average was what it took to preserve families from becoming evicted. But really importantly was 40% almost of the households that we were serving in the rental assistance phase. We were unable to connect with a landlord. They didn't have a traditional lease arrangement. They didn't have a way to accept a rental payment. And so that really drove what we have proposed to do next. The next slide. So how are we going to handle this going forward? State of California rolled out a big tent option, up to 80% AMI, partnering with a single CDFI, an online application portal. It's a landlord-centric design, and that will work for a large majority of people who need rental assistance, but it will not, in our estimation, be effective for the most vulnerable families who have are not traditionally leased. And that for us was about almost 40%. So California, I'm not sure how it works in other places, but there was one option through the state of California to retain the money that was directly allocated for us from the federal government, which for the county of Santa Clara and the city of San Jose is about $57 million. Our community agreed to stand together and keep that money local and have a rental relief effort that we will run using this community-driven approach that can be in tandem with the bigger tent option that the state of California is rolling out. So you can see some of the key program elements, again, prioritizing ELI households, a simplified process, and really a community-driven model. Next slide. Okay, so we think everyone should do this, prioritize the lowest income, most vulnerable households. For us, because this money can only go to landlords, it is limiting. It is great that we can pay rent, but in surveys that we've done with households, and as we all know, this is not the only problem. This is not the only crisis, not the only debt that our families have endured. We have families who have gone to predatory lenders, payday loans. They have other bills that have not been paid. So we want to make sure that we have access points and that we have partnerships where we're able to understand both what is needed and required from the public dollars, and also how we can raise and use private money to be directly given to families to solve some of the other problems that they've had. So I think the key to doing this well, and what we've learned, is to make it as flexible as possible and let the community drive what the requirements need to be. It needs to be designed for the most vulnerable households. Design it for families without non-traditional leases, and you can help everybody, right? So be explicit about what documentation is required and require the bare minimum in order to get it done. Diane, I think I'm pushing up against my time, so I'm going to pause there.
It's so helpful, Jen. Thank you. And really, I couldn't agree more with all of your recommendations. I'd ask, Jerry asked, and I think you covered some of this already, but Jerry's asking about strengths and weaknesses of this kind of a program. And so you certainly made the case for why it's so important and the strengths of it. Can you talk a little bit about, I'd say, what some of the challenges have been, both in creating this type of a program, a community-driven program, and what do you see as some of the challenges there might be in implementation?
That's a great question. So, I think that the burden of responsibility has been a challenge, meaning the 70 or so agencies that did this alongside us over for most of the last year are often very small, a couple of staff people or volunteer run, already providing basic needs like food, trying to help with testing, now getting into vaccinations. I mean, the amount of burden that has been placed on community and community leaders, it often feels like it's been extraordinary. So we're very aware of capacity, and truly, frankly, what that means is we need to support financially the capacities that these organizations need to get this work done, right? And so that's a priority for us. I'd say going forward, a big concern for us is really working in partnership with the state. So we're happy that LISC is administering this effort, and we want to be able to work with them to make sure we're not duplicating, that we can refer we'd say less vulnerable families into the big state system, and that we're not missing anybody that is eligible. Fears we have is how if a landlord has 10 units and has had problems historically with a few of the tenants, how are we ensuring that all of the tenants will be protected through these big tent approaches? And so I think actually we could hear about that more a little bit later on this call from the folks that are speaking, but those are the concerns that we have.
Thank you. And can you talk, Jen, explicitly about undocumented immigrants and how you've approached their needs?
We've done there's been no differentiation, meaning
Yeah.
we've partnered with community groups that are already serving our undocumented community and provided financial assistance in the ways that they requested. We've used gift cards. We've partnered with Family Independence Initiative, who's amazing on QR codes and how we are electronic transfers. We've written checks to landlords. And so I think, I'll say the main thing that the undocumented community said to us was, do not call it an undocumented fund. Now, that was one of the biggest recommendations that they made to us.
Mm-hmm. There's also a question here from Emily Warren, and she's asking if you could speak about the tension between prioritizing the lowest income households and requiring the 20% forgiveness for landlords, which automatically excludes households receiving federal housing assistance from getting help with the unsubsidized portion of their rent. And maybe you can explain, just for listeners who are not from California, what Emily means when she's talking about the 20% forgiveness for landlords.
Sure. So the legislation says that if a landlord accepts 80% of the payments, they're by taking this money, they're forgiving 20%. And so that is requiring the landlord to forgive a portion of the money in exchange for being made 80% of the way whole. If they reject that, then the option I had mentioned, which is the 25% option stands, where the tenant can pay 25% of their rent and not be able to be legally evicted. It doesn't mean that the debt is forgiven. So that's sort of how it's working in California. I'm not 100% sure I understand the question, though.
Sorry, I was muted. I actually didn't either. I didn't know if I was missing something for California, but yeah, Emily, maybe we can get back to you, because I'm not sure why this provision in the California program would exclude households receiving federal housing assistance. I don't think that it would, but I might be missing something. So maybe we can follow up afterwards. So Jen, that seems to be all the questions for now. Again, many thanks for your leadership and for getting on the call to share this. And just for everybody's information, some of the team at NLIHC are working with the team at Destination Home and pulling this all together into a best practice case study that we'll share out with everybody as soon as we can, since it's such an important approach that we hope many other communities will also utilize. So Jen, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And for anyone listening, if you're interested in, we have, whole implementation guides around this work. So let me know and we can connect you if you're looking at doing something similar.
Great. Thanks, Jen. Okay, so I'm going to turn now to the next agenda item, which is updates on eviction moratorium and on emergency rental assistance. So I'll start with the eviction moratorium. And let everybody know that last week, I and some colleagues, which I'll mention in a moment, participated in a listening session with the White House and other administration staff to talk about the need to further extend and strengthen, improve, and enforce the eviction moratorium. So it was a very good meeting. It was pulled together by Seamus Roller at the National Housing Law Project at the White House's request. And the speakers included Rashida Phillips from Community Legal Services of Philadelphia, Emily Benfer, Wake Forest University, Tim Thomas from Urban Displacement Project of UC Berkeley, Sandra Park from ACLU, Tara Raghavir from Casey Tenants, and myself. And on the line from the administration, there were about 15 staff that were there from the White House, HUD, USDA, CFPB, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the Department of Treasury, and the CDC. And the purpose of the call really was for those administration officials to hear from us about why it is so essential that they not only extend the moratorium, but fix it and strengthen it so that it protects all tenants in need of the protection, and to enforce it. And so they, really didn't give any indication about process or timing that they might be thinking about for any changes to the moratorium. But we, I think, made a really strong case for why it's so essential, and talked at length about certainly the public health implications, and the implications for the racial inequities of evictions, as we've seen the same racial inequities from COVID, and just how essential it is from a racial equity perspective that the administration act. Also, separately from that meeting, Sarah Sadian from NLIHC participated in a different call with USDA on the same topic of the eviction moratorium. So clearly the administration is aware, I'd say they're well aware of our request that they strengthen and enforce the moratorium. And I think they clearly are giving it a lot of thought. They may be having additional listening sessions with others. I'm not sure what that process is. But then today, you may have seen this morning that the administration announced that they are extending the COVID forbearance and foreclosure protections for homeowners. So you might remember that on the first day in office, President Biden extended both the eviction moratorium and the foreclosure moratorium through the end of March. So now he's taken another step for homeowners, and he has extended the foreclosure moratorium through the end of June of this year. And he's, along with that action, they're also taking the action of extending the mortgage payment forbearance enrollment window until the end of June, and providing up to 6 months of additional mortgage payment forbearance in 3-month increments for homeowners who enter forbearance before the end of June. So some significant new protections there for homeowners. They've also created what they're calling a centralized resource for housing assistance. And it says it's for both homeowners and renters that can go to this website and learn more about relief options. And the website is consumerfinance.gov/housing. I haven't actually checked it out myself yet, so I'm not sure what's on it, but that's what they're recommending that people go to. So I think it's good and notable that President Biden is extending the foreclosure moratorium through the end of June. And of course, now we're urging him to do the same for the eviction moratorium and to improve and enforce that moratorium at the same time. So we are going to reopen and recirculate the sign-on letter that we've had in the past, urging President Biden and the CDC director and the HUD secretary to improve and enforce the eviction moratorium. I'm pretty sure everybody who's on this call today has already signed it. You'll remember that in the past we've had over 2,000 organizations signed on. We initially had the letter addressed to the previous CDC director, and then we readdressed it to Congress to have them extend it, and then we readdressed it to President Biden and the CDC director. So that same letter, we're going to recirculate and reopen for signatures. Again, at last count, we had 2,004 organizations signed on. I hope that we can get it over 2,500 so that we can send it again to President Biden and just, keep the pressure on and keep reminding him and the administration of the urgency of these improvements, because there are, as you all know very well, there's an alarming number of evictions that are happening despite the order, and those loopholes that are in the order are being exploited by some landlords and need to be closed in order to save lives and keep people housed during the pandemic. So I hope you'll help us circulate that letter. I think we're going to send out an e-blast to our full network, including all of you, tomorrow to start that process again. So please circulate it to your networks, help us spread it far and wide so we can get as strong of a letter as possible to send back to the administration. Let me just see if there's any questions on the eviction moratorium before. Oh, great. Okay, I see Paul and Elena are putting lots of important links into.
There is a question, Diane, in the Q&A box.
Yeah, I'm getting to that. Thanks, Sarah. Putting lots of links into the chat box, and Natalie Harris says that we're seeing approximately 14 evictions a day in Louisville, even with the moratorium only being prevented today due to snow closing down the courts. And unfortunately, we're seeing that in many communities. It's interesting because in some communities, the moratorium is really working. And in some communities, eviction courts have been shut down completely and they're not opening again until the moratorium expires. And in other communities, these evictions are just continuing to move forward. Let's see. There's a question about would it be helpful to share needed eviction moratorium improvements with OMB? And somebody's asking who has a meeting with OMB staffers. I don't think OMB has played a central role yet in the administration conversations about whether and how to extend the moratorium, but I would say, yes, if you have a meeting with anybody from the administration, it would be very helpful if you could continue to make the case for why these moratoriums are so important and why it's not sufficient as it is. Somebody else is asking, how do we find out what the loopholes that landlords, what are the loopholes? So I'm going to ask if somebody from the team can put in the chat box the letter again that we've sent, because in that letter, we list out all of the flaws with the existing moratorium and the changes that are needed to improve it. And those are the loopholes. So, one being that it's not an automatic protection. So tenants need to know that the moratorium exists. They need to know what actions they need to take in order to receive it. And we're finding that some of the most marginalized tenants, seniors without access to the internet, or immigrants for whom English is not their first language, some of the people who are most in need of these protections are least likely to be aware of them. And there are certainly landlords are exploiting this information gap. And another real challenge is the question of whether the moratorium applies to lease expirations, people who are on month-to-month leases, to no-cause evictions. And actually, Eric Dunn from the Law Project is going to talk more in depth about that soon. But the letter lists out all of the shortcomings and the flaws in the current order and the ways that we need to see them improved. Okay, I'm going to talk now a little bit about, I see there's more questions coming in, and I'll get to them throughout the call, but I want to turn to updates on the Emergency Rental Assistance Program out of Treasury. So many of you know who are on this call that at NLHC, we've been tracking throughout the pandemic, we've been tracking all emergency rental assistance programs that have been created, or all that we know of. And we have a public-facing database, we have a map, we put out research and did analysis of all the programs. At last count, we were up to a little over 600 emergency rental assistance programs that have been created. Up until now, those programs were created with far more limited funds that were provided under the CARES Act. So that 600 emergency rental assistance programs accounts for about between $4 and $5 billion. We're now continuing to track all of the programs that are either now being replenished with new emergency rental assistance funds or new programs that are being created because there are new emergency rental assistance programs, funds. And we'll update that database 2 or 3 times a week, and you'll be able to differentiate on the database whether these are pre-COVID rental assistance programs that were created in 2020, or programs that are being created in 2021 with the $25 billion allocation. And some of the programs with the $25 billion, those funds were distributed to states and localities on January 26th. And so programs since that time have been starting to put their programs together. And as of today, we know of 5 states that have opened their emergency rental assistance programs with the $25 billion. So the 5 states are Alaska, Kentucky, Missouri, Texas, and as of just this afternoon, Virginia. And then Mississippi's program, the statewide program, is not open yet, but they are accepting applications and creating a waiting list with them. And then we also know of 22 counties or cities that have their emergency rental assistance programs open. And those are cities or counties in probably about 8 or 9 states. So we are continuing to track all of these programs. If you know of programs that are opening that I didn't just mention, or really anytime you find out about a local program that is opening with this $25 billion in emergency rental assistance, please reach out to us at NLHC. You can reach out to any of us individually, or you can send an email to research@nlhc.org and let us know about the program so that we continue to have as comprehensive as possible a list of all the emergency rental assistance programs that are out there. I also want to remind everybody of the research and learnings and best practices that we have already published on emergency rental assistance programs, and just really encourage program administrators and local advocates and tenants to look at and consider when these new funds are being used. So back in July of 2020, we published a paper on state and local rental assistance programs and some early learnings. And Elena is going to drop links to all of these reports in the chat box now. In October of 2020, we published a report on emergency rental assistance programs in response to COVID. And we published 2 reports in January, one on best practices for state and local emergency rental assistance, and another on an analysis and findings from a survey of 200 program administrators. So there's a lot of really important learnings in all of these reports that, our hope is that they will be applied to these new programs that are being created. We're working on, the research team is working on more analysis. We'll have another research note out in early March. And also a reminder that we took all of these learnings and put them into a letter that we sent to the Department of Treasury and HUD and President Biden right after inauguration, really urging them to use these learnings and apply them to the $25 billion in emergency rental assistance program. So take a look at that letter as well as a reminder of kind of a synopsis of all the best practices that we think are essential, they be included in emergency rental assistance programs, and a lot of the ones Jen already named in the program that she and their partners have designed. So after we sent that letter to Treasury, or it was right around the same time, the day before President Biden was inaugurated, you'll remember that the Department of Treasury on the last day of President Trump's administration put out an FAQ that's very problematic in a number of ways for how communities use their $25 billion. And it's problematic because it favors the landlord in places where it doesn't need to. It goes beyond the statute in places where it shouldn't. It requires burdensome and unnecessary documentation that's going to limit the number of the most marginalized people who need the assistance from getting it. So it's really problematic. So we wrote a follow-up letter immediately after inauguration urging the Department of Treasury to rescind that FAQ and start over and put out guidance that follows the statute and helps get the funds to the people who need it the most. So since that time, we know that the Treasury Department and HUD and others within the administration have been working closely to revise and put out a new FAQ. It's been about 2 weeks, I think now, since they put a note on their website saying that the FAQs are being revised and will be published very soon, but they're not published yet. And I don't have an update on when they will be, except I do know that the administration staff at HUD and Treasury are working as fast as they can, recognizing the urgency, and hope to get out a revised FAQ soon. And I hope that the FAQ will be more aligned with the recommendations that we've made. And as soon as we know that new guidance or FAQ is out, certainly we'll share it widely. Just one more thing to say is that in addition to the research that we have coming out soon, the research team is also likely to do a few webinars along the same lines of helping program administrators learn best practices and then apply them. So we'll have a couple webinars on, for example, how to set up and operate income-weighted equitable rental assistance lotteries, and how to efficiently and quickly make payments directly to renters when landlords are unresponsive, and so on, really pulling out some of the areas that may be the problem areas and offering best practices and guidance on how to overcome them. So you can look out for those soon. We're also, together with UPenn, NLIC and UPenn together, are doing a survey of some program administrators to get a better idea of the rent arrears that are out there. You know, there's a lot of good estimates. They vary widely because we don't, up until now, we really haven't had broad data on what rent arrears exist. So we're doing a survey on that. If any of you are on this call and program administrators and want to participate in that survey and share that information with us, please also send an email to research@nlic.org, and we would love to have your help with that. Okay, I'm going to check on, I think actually I'm going to move to our next speaker because it's also related to eviction moratoriums. And then I will keep looking over some of the questions and see what else I can answer after Eric speaks. So I'm going to, actually, let me make sure that Eric is on. Eric, are you on?
I'm here.
Okay, great. So Eric Dunn has been on the call many times before with the National Housing Law Project, really close partner of ours on all of this work. And they just put out a memo on the application of the CDC eviction order to lease expiration and no cause eviction notices, something that comes up again and again. So Eric, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks so much for joining today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So this issue has really exploded in recent weeks. Our national listserv has about 1,600 housing advocates on it. Really since the CDC eviction moratorium was first issued, there have been questions around whether it covers evictions that aren't formally based on non-payment of rent. It's where either the lease has expired and the owner just says, well, I'm not renewing your lease, and isn't giving a reason for that. Very likely is, because the tenant's behind in rent or has been behind in rent recently. And so that's the motivation for it. Or people who don't even have a term lease. Maybe they had one and it's expired, or they never had one, but they're in a month-to-month tenancy, a periodic tenancy that can be terminated normally without a reason in most jurisdictions, just by giving usually a 30-day notice. Sometimes it can be a little longer, a little shorter than that. But typically the landlord just gives a notice saying the tenancy is being terminated at the end of the next rental period. And again, there's no reason given. In many circumstances during the moratorium, the reason that's motivating the landlord's action is often the non-payment of rent or concern that the tenant's not going to remain current in rent, which, you know, if the landlord came right out and said that, would clearly be covered by the moratorium. And as we initially interpreted the CDC moratorium and included in our original analysis document, we believe that those circumstances were already covered by the moratorium as well, because the way the moratorium is written, it creates 5 enumerated circumstances where evictions are allowed. All 5 of them require some type of lease violation by the tenant. And so a mere lease expiration or a no cause notice would not be a lease violation, would not be a cognizable ground for eviction during the moratorium period. Unfortunately, as time has gone on, it looks like a lot of courts have, you know, frankly, what seems to be happening is there's a lot of judges and a lot of jurisdictions that are just incredulous that people who don't pay rent should be able to, you know, still have housing, which, you know, it's unbelievable. I think to me that some judges feel this way during a pandemic, but nonetheless, that seems to be the dynamic. And so in a lot of courts, you have judges looking for any reason they can cling to evict a tenant who's behind in rent. And they've accepted this pretty weak argument that, well, if this isn't formally based on non-payment or rent, it's based on a lease expiration or it's based on a no cause notice. So for that reason, we prepared a new memo that's specifically addressed just to this issue. We hope it'll be of use to advocates and at least trying to make the various legal arguments that are available to prevent eviction for non-payment of rent. If a court will not agree with those arguments entirely, it also discusses a fallback argument where at least if the tenant can show that the landlord is motivated by non-payment of rent, that the eviction should be barred, even if it's not formally based on non-payment. I will say the memo does mention there are 2 cases pending in state appellate courts right now on this issue. So hopefully we'll get a decision from one of those courts favorable before too much longer, that other courts around the country might be willing to follow. And of course, this is something that we've been trying to get across to the CDC in hopes that they will either issue a revised order or at least revise the FAQ document, which is really the source of a lot of this problem, to address this issue. So that's all I really have to say. I'm happy to answer any questions that folks might have about this for the time I have left.
Thanks, Eric. That's helpful. We have one question or more of a comment from Abby, who notes that pets are a very common excuse when the landlord can't evict for non-payment of rent, and judges have not been sympathetic to tenants who have animals in violation of the lease. So any suggestions or guidance you can offer there?
Yeah, well, the reasons that the CDC moratorium does give for permissible grounds for evictions include basically any type of lease violation other than non-payment of rent. So if somebody does have an animal in the premises that they're not supposed to have, it's a violation of the lease, that would be a permissible ground. I think in most jurisdictions, that would be a type of ordinary lease violation where the tenant would have at least the opportunity to cure the violation. So if you could find another place to for the pet to go, that might be the easiest way to cure that sort of a thing. I think a lot of those types of situations, you may have a landlord where the lease says that, but the landlord knew about the pet and sort of went along with it. And then all of a sudden now the tenant's behind in rent. And so they're using that as a pretext. That type of defense is cognizable in the vast majority of jurisdictions, but it's kind of messy and relies on evidence that may or may not be available. So a tenant may be in kind of a precarious position if they have to rely on that sort of an argument. But generally speaking, if there is some type of lease violation, even a minor one, it potentially can supply grounds for termination. So it's important to be aware of the tenant's cure rights and make sure they're able to rectify the violation while they have time before they are subject to eviction.
Thanks, Eric. And an anonymous person is asking whether this analysis of yours means that tenants at will can be covered by the protections under the order.
So the term tenant at will has different meanings in different states. In some jurisdictions, that's another word for a tenant that doesn't have a lease. So if you're a month-to-month tenant, some states might call that a tenancy at will, be terminated at any time by either party. In other states, tenant at will means somebody who's not actually a residential tenant at all. That means your friend from out of town who needs a place to stay and crashes on the couch in your basement for a couple of weeks, doesn't pay rent, doesn't have any kind of agreement, and then just decides he's not going to leave. That person is considered a tenant at will. The idea being that they can stay as long as the owner allows them, but they don't have the normal rights of a residential tenant. So if you're in a jurisdiction where tenancy at will means basically the same thing as a month-to-month tenant or a periodic tenant, that person actually does have the rights of a residential tenant. And the CDC moratorium would apply to them. Someone who's a tenant at will, meaning they're not actually a residential tenant, they're just somebody staying at a residence with permission of the owner that can be revoked at any time, and they're not paying rent and they don't have a rental agreement. They wouldn't qualify as a residential tenant under the CDC moratorium. So they would have to look elsewhere for any kind of protection.
Okay, thanks, Eric. I think that's all the questions we have. We have a few people sharing helpful links and comments about what's happening in their communities, and Jerry thanking you and NHLP for your efforts on this. But it looks like that's all the questions for now. So Eric, I appreciate you joining, and I saw you dropped the link into the chat box for your analysis, and we'll share it out with our network as a follow-up to this call.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks again.
Thank you. And it's available on our website. So if anybody doesn't get it in the chat, you can always go to nhlp.org and find it on our COVID page.
Great. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye. Okay, I want to go back to a few questions that came in related to the updates. So somebody was asking to hear again which states have opened up their rental assistance programs with the emergency rental assistance allocation, and somebody else asking if any tribal communities have opened theirs. So the statewide, and again, remember that the way the allocation works is that states receive an allocation, and then in most cases, cities and localities in that state also can receive a direct allocation. So when I talk about a state whose eviction emergency rental assistance program has opened, I'm talking about they're using their statewide allocation. There may be other programs within the state that haven't opened yet. So the statewide allocation programs that have opened are Alaska, Kentucky, Missouri, Texas, and Virginia. Those are the 5 states. As a 6th, the state of Mississippi has not opened their program, but they are allowing people to apply, and they're establishing a waiting list with it. And in addition, in Hawaii, the state of Hawaii has not opened a program with its state allocation, but the Native Hawaiians allocation was 2.4 million. And so the Native Hawaiian program in Hawaii is open. And then in addition, there are 22 counties or cities that have opened up their emergency rental assistance program already, or they're opening it tomorrow. And we know of a total of 33 counties or cities that have opened or announced their opening date for the near future. And those are cities or localities in the states of Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, California, Georgia, Idaho, Kentucky, Louisiana, North Carolina, Ohio, Texas, and Wisconsin. And again, those programs will be listed in the public-facing link that we have on our website for all rental assistance programs. So we'll share that again, and we'll continue to update that as we get information. There's a question about, well, just to read, somebody else is asking about the FAQ from Treasury. So just to reiterate, FAQ, the Department of Treasury and HUD are working together to revise the FAQ that was published on the last day of the Trump administration. They are working diligently. They've asked us a lot of really good questions and asked for a lot of specific examples of how different aspects of programs have worked on the ground, which of course we've shared with them. So they're working on it, and it will be out soon, but I don't know. I can't say more than that. I don't know. I hope it's out this week, but I don't know. Okay. So I'm going to turn now to our next speaker. Oh, actually, let me just check one more thing. Okay, there's also a question about home. And actually, Sarah, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself and answer that question. There's a question asking about whether home funds can be used to pay rent arrears.
Yeah, that's a great question. Under the normal home statute, home funds cannot be used for back rent. It's only used for forward-looking rental agreements, usually in 1-year increments. I need to check with folks on our team and look at the HUD website to see if they've issued any waivers that would allow for those funds to be used for back rent, but I don't believe that's the case.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And we'll share more information if it when we have it on that. Thanks for the question. All right, I'm going to turn now to our first field update, which comes from Christine Hess. She's the executive director of the Nevada Housing Coalition. Christine, thanks so much for joining the call. I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, Diane. Thank you so much for having me. And thanks, NLIHC, for all the updates and all your continued advocacy. There's so many activities happening to support Nevadans. So today, though, I'm going to describe how Nevada's addressed some of our housing insecurity in particular. Nevada's renters disproportionately represent the share of those most impacted by the pandemic. For those of you that may not know, Nevada renters were already in crisis before the pandemic. And in fact, the 2020 NLIHC Gap report showed Nevada as having the greatest shortage in the country of available and affordable housing for our extremely low-income households. So as we heard in the update, the moratoriums are definitely a concern. So even though we, of course, had the CDC moratorium in place, our Nevada's first eviction moratorium expired in October, and we did see a surge in eviction filings. So as a result of advocacy by legal aid, especially here in Nevada, in December, our governor reinstated our state's eviction moratorium, and this is working, but it is currently set to expire at the end of March. As a result of this, and we want to recognize that keeping Nevadans housed is the most important outcome of this eviction moratorium, but we are also monitoring and working to mitigate a couple of the downstream consequences, like a very low vacancy rate and increased fair market rents, which make rapid rehousing that much more difficult. And additionally, according to the Nevada State Apartment Association, which does represent 67% of our state's multifamily housing, landlords across the state are dealing with millions in lost revenues on a monthly basis. From a mediation perspective, Home Means Nevada is a nonprofit here that was established during the Great Recession to deal with the massive foreclosure crisis. This mediation program is working again for homeowners. Happy to hear. Thank you for that update, Diane, about the forbearance and foreclosure extensions. But not surprisingly, the greatest demand is actually on their brand new program called Renters Connect. During a special session this summer, the Nevada legislature passed emergency legislation to support eviction mediation, but they did not make it required. It is optional. But that program was definitely in demand when our moratorium expired, and currently is getting a little bit of relief with our moratorium back in place. Finally, I'd like to use some of this time to thank NLIHC and really support their advocacy for the U.S. Treasury to revise their guidance relative to the rental assistance that was part of the December aid package. A lot of the questions are the same questions we have. The U.S. Treasury has needlessly slowed down aid to hurting Nevada families by eliminating the ability of tenants to self-attest that they have experienced a COVID health or economic impact, which affected their ability to pay rent. Last spring, before the pandemic, Nevada, like many other states, did not have a statewide emergency rental assistance program. So when the CARES Act passed, there were no existing statewide mechanisms in place to distribute the millions of dollars of aid to Nevada renters. Our state partners not only acted quickly under unprecedented demands and strains, but they also acted smartly. With support from our state treasurer, Zach Conine, the Nevada Housing Division coordinated with Clark County. For those of you that don't know, Clark County is where Las Vegas is housed and has 2/3 of our population for the state. But they coordinated with Clark County to establish the CARES Housing Assistance Program, which provided consistency in the program to make it easier for all Nevadans, which was just huge and awesome of them to coordinate those efforts. This program has distributed a combined $75 million, approximately $30 million from the state and $45 million from Clark County in emergency housing assistance, with support from the Nevada Rural Housing Authority, Reno Housing Authority, and approximately 11 local nonprofits in Clark County. So I just also want to give a special shout out and thank you to Steve Acroth, the administrator for the Nevada Housing Division, who helped provide me with some of the most up-to-date data. So our programs are accepting applications right now for the new programs. So Diane and team, you can update your data with that. They're accepting applications, but not quite distributing aid yet. We are experiencing delays, as not only have we had to restructure eligibility requirements for the new funding approved by Congress in December, but it also has to deal with the limiting required that we've spoken about today and I mentioned earlier, and that is the inability for tenants to complete a self-attestation to show their impacts due to COVID. This is placing a burden on our applicants, our Nevadans, and also on the administering agencies, as they must now work back through their existing queue of thousands of applicants, families, to request more documentation and now add a step of verification. So that's our update here in Nevada, Diane and team, and I'm happy to answer any questions, and my contact is there for anyone that wants to reach out.
Really helpful, Christine. Thank you for the update and thanks for your great work. And just to clarify, so thank you for that information. So the statewide program in Nevada is open now, you've said, yes?
Well, they're open to accept applications, but they're not yet ready. They're still working on the back end from the distribution part.
Okay, so yeah, probably similar to what the state of Mississippi is doing,
Yes.
sort of starting a waiting list.
Yeah, it sounded very similar.
All right, that's really helpful to know. And it's also very helpful and really troubling to hear about the additional work that the state has to do to create, to require this unnecessary, burdensome documentation that unfortunately the Treasury FAQ asks for. And so when a new FAQ comes out, and I hope that it either requires much less onerous documentation or best case scenario allows for self-certification, how will that change your program, and how will that, you know, sort of alter what the way the program is working now? How will you have to go back and redo things? And will you? Will
Yeah,
the state?
Thanks, Diane. I can't speak for the state or those administering the program specifically, but what I can tell you, as they developed the original program, the CARES Housing Assistance Program, which whether we call it 2.0 or ERAP, you know, everybody has these acronyms. I can tell you that they did pivot. They, you know, did make revisions to their application processes to make it smoother based on what we heard nationally, what was working in other areas, what was acceptable. So I'm hopeful that as the revisions come out, I would anticipate that they'll take that into consideration and work back towards that self-attestation, which they already had in place. So they do have that process already in place. But I will have to get back to your team when and if we see that to let you know how they're responding.
Okay, that would be helpful to know. And thanks again for sharing that and for flagging it. And I just ask everybody else who's on this call, if you know of state or city or local programs that are moving forward and utilizing the existing FAQ. If you could let us know, we're sharing all of that directly with Treasury and HUD administration staff, just to keep them updated on the problems that FAQ is creating, and continue to urge them to move quickly to correct them. So thanks for sharing that. And it looks like we don't have any other questions for you today, Christine. So thanks again so much for joining and for your good work. Okay, and I see that we have an update on the question about whether home funds can be used. To pay back rent, and Ed Gramlich from the NLHC team shared some information. I don't think he can unmute himself. So Sarah, do you want to share the update?
Yeah, happy to. Thank you so much, Ed, for sharing that in the chat box. It looks like HUD did release a memorandum on December 4th to allow home funds to be used to help pay for past due rent and fees, including late fees and past due utility costs. You can see a link to that memorandum in the chat box. And thanks to the folks who raised the question.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Ed. All right, I'm going to turn now to our next speaker, another field update, this time from Atlanta. We'll hear from Lindsey Siegel, who's the Director of Housing Advocacy with the Atlanta Legal Aid Society. Lindsey, thanks for joining. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. So I'm going to talk today about the way that rental assistance is being distributed in DeKalb County, which is where I do sort of the majority of my work. So just to give a little bit of context, with about 750,000 residents, DeKalb is the 4th largest county in Georgia by population. And we understand that there are about 8,000 eviction cases currently sitting in the Magistrate Court of DeKalb County, which is where evictions are heard. And they're in various stages of the process. Our county does continue to hear eviction cases. The interpretation of the CDC moratorium really varies by judge, even within that county. And in some cases, judges are signing eviction orders, but are only staying the very last step in the eviction process. And that's where what's called the writ of possession in Georgia is executed by the marshal's office. So an update on the new money. As part of the federal rent relief that was passed at the end of December, DeKalb County was awarded $21 million. And the county organized a group called the Tenant Landlord Assistance Coalition to distribute rental and utility assistance. The Magistrate Court of DeKalb County is at the center of that coalition. One rental assistance agency, Goodwill of North Georgia, is in charge of managing and distributing all of the funds. And we at Atlanta Legal Aid were asked to help negotiate and resolve all those cases that are pending where landlords are represented by attorneys, which is, the vast majority of cases that are filed in the county. So the project is really meant to simplify and streamline the rental assistance process. And there's these sort of symbiotic goals. The court wants to clear its docket because it's taking an immense amount of time to process these cases through Zoom hearings, which is the only way that hearings are being heard in DeKalb. Plus, the marshal's office has not executed any of these writs in months, so they're facing a considerable backlog. Atlanta Legal Aid wants to help resolve as many of these pending cases as possible, of course, without tenants simply losing their homes and becoming homeless. So like so many of you, we saw that the distribution of initial CARES Act funds was very complicated, especially for our clients, our tenants trying to apply. Our county originally had about 20 different agencies acting as the go-between for getting those funds out to families. And really what that meant, at least on our end, is many different application processes, many different documentation requirements. It was sometimes very difficult for us to keep track of who had money and who was out of money. And then we, of course, had many landlords refusing to cooperate. So we're glad that the Magistrate Court and the county has asked us to be part of this effort. It's going to be pretty massive. The very ambitious goal is to resolve about 1,000 pending eviction cases in as quickly as 3 months. We think it may take as many as 6. That would come out to about 60 to 80 cases per week, and then go from there as more money hopefully becomes available. And again, our role is really to negotiate with the landlord attorneys to try to get this money distributed. So the details are still being worked out because this coalition was just announced last week, but we think that this plan does improve upon the CARES Act distribution in a few key ways. One is the county has one set of paperwork requirements, which, although they do still require, some documentation that we would prefer not be there, it's just one set of paperwork requirements. So it's much easier to help tenants get that paperwork together. The tenants and landlords apply directly through the court, and then the court itself is going to sift through those applications to send us the ones that are appropriate for our part. Once we resolve a particular case through negotiation, we don't then have to find the assistance. We just send the case back to the court for the payment processing through Goodwill. And tenants with a current lease without a current lease or without a traditional lease can provide alternative documentation to show that they're renting a home. There are other alternative documentation options for some of the other requirements as well, which we appreciate. There's also an option for rental assistance going forward, depending on the funds that are available. We think this would certainly further help prevent homelessness, because what we found is that so many of our clients were behind the very next month after we sort of made this Herculean effort to help them catch up by getting them rental assistance. And we're also hoping that there's going to be some kind of option to distribute funds when landlords refuse to participate, although again, we're sort of still working out the details for that. The magistrate court set a income limit, tenant income limit of 80% of the area median income. And they opened the application at 9 a.m. this past Friday. And what we've heard from the court is that by 3 p.m. that day, they had received about 2,000 applications. So they're getting started. They're starting with the cases where the writ of possession has already been signed by the judge, which is not the part of the process that we're going to be involved in. So we have a couple weeks to kind of work out the details on our end, but we're very glad to be a part of it. And I'm happy to answer any questions I can.
That's very helpful, Lindsey. Thanks for sharing. And interesting time too, because I was actually having a conversation with somebody from another state who is looking to do something similar and was asking about other programs that engage with the courts and landlords in the way that you're talking about. So after this call, I may make a connection between you two, if you don't mind. I think it would be really helpful to them to hear more about what you're doing and how it's working. And there's a question about what, if anything, you or others in Atlanta are doing to help the tenants who never reach eviction court, who leave before that step happens.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the difficult things about this particular rental assistance, is because it is going through the court and the court has its own goals of resolving these cases. This chunk of money is, as I'm understanding it, is particularly for eviction, pending eviction cases. I'm hoping that if more money is sent through the states, through the Biden administration's proposal, that there will be additional rental assistance. During the fall and early winter, we were able to connect tenants with rental assistance that went towards security deposit and first month's rent at a new place. There's nothing to say that this money can't be used for that. I just know that the courts are prioritizing their pending cases. And I kind of anticipate that, by the time they're done resolving those, a lot of the money is going to be gone from this effort. So, we still serve tenants in the way we always have, by them applying with us directly for our legal assistance. And we're going to continue to do that. This is just, one aspect of our assistance through the courts.
Got it. Thanks, Lindsey. I don't see any other questions for now, although we may have some follow-up ones later. So thanks for your work and thanks for sharing and joining the call today.
Thank you.
So speaking about the need for more emergency rental assistance than the $25 billion that's been allocated, I'm going to turn now to Sarah Sadian to talk about and share an update on new housing and homelessness resources in the next COVID relief package. And Sarah, there were a couple questions that came in before the call or during the call asking about specifically about the $5 billion in home for homelessness funding. So if you could talk about what those funds can be used for and what, if anything, Congress is going to do about the need to extend and improve the eviction moratorium. So Sarah, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. I'll definitely make sure I hit on those topics that you raised. First, I wanted to start off on where things are with COVID relief package, and then we can go into some details about what's included in that bill. So last week, the House Financial Services Committee approved their COVID relief bill. Their bill totaled about $75 billion in resources, including about $40 billion in housing and homelessness money. They passed their bill after about 2 days of committee debate and votes on amendments. We were pleased to see that none of the amendments that were offered that would have impacted housing and homelessness programs were enacted. Only Republicans offered amendments to the bill, and many of those would have taken some harmful steps to either limit access to resources or deny them wholeheartedly to others. So we're happy to see that that didn't go forward. Some of the Republican amendments included things like changing the deadlines to make a much shorter time frame for cities and states to spend down their resources, not allowing immigrants or mixed status immigrant households to receive emergency rental assistance. Some offered to tie or required to tie emergency rental assistance to school openings. Others would have imposed criminal penalties against people who fraudulently apply for emergency rental assistance, which is already against the law, but would have had a chilling effect. So we're really glad to see that none of those passed. That means that the bill can now move forward in the next stage of this budget reconciliation process. We expect this week for that financial services bills and other bills from other committees will go to the House Budget Committee. This week, they'll package that all together into one big $1.9 trillion package. And we'll see as soon as next week a vote on the House floor. We do not expect to see amendments on the House floor, so I think that process will be relatively quick. After it passes the House, we'll see the Senate process take place. We know that the Senate is not going to be marking up their own versions of the bill in committee. They're skipping that committee process, and they're going straight to amendments and floor votes the following week. At that point in time, we'll probably be calling on all of you to be engaging with your members of Congress, engaging with your senators, to encourage them to vote against any harmful amendments that would restrict funding or cut funding for housing and homelessness. The plan is for congressional leaders. They still hope that they can pass a final bill before March 14th when unemployment benefits expire. They are on track to do that, and things are moving very, very quickly. I will give a brief overview. I'd love to give a brief overview of what's in the bill, including the Homelessness Fund, so we can start there if that's easiest. The bill provides $5 billion in homelessness assistance. It's sort of a unique design for these dollars. They wanted to have a really broad set of uses for the funds. And so the funds can be used not just for services that we would typically see under the ESG or Emergency Solutions Grant Program, but also can be used to build or acquire and convert space into non-congregate shelter or into permanent affordable housing. So overall, the funds can be used to serve people who are experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness, people who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, and people who have veterans who have a family member that meet that criteria. And lastly, people who supportive services would help prevent their family from becoming homeless. So it's a pretty broad set of definitions, but very targeted to people experiencing homelessness. The funds are technically going to be allocated using the home investment partnerships formula. So we'll go out to home. It'll be distributed that way. There are a lot of waivers involved. It does not require a commitment deadline or matching requirements or set-asides for community housing development organizations. And it allows for up to 15% of the dollars to be used for administrative costs. I think their goal with this funds is not just to look at what the immediate needs are for people experiencing homelessness, but also to start to provide this down payment that can be used to help transition individuals into permanent housing. We're hoping that much of these funds can be used to help cities and states acquire hotels and motels where they've been housing people experiencing homelessness and converting that over the long term into permanent housing. The bill also includes $25 billion in emergency rental assistance. The bulk of those funds go through the Coronavirus Relief Fund Treasury program that we've been talking about. This is the program that Congress funded at $25 billion in December, and that we're starting to see reach communities in the last couple of weeks. Of that amount, there's $19 billion overall for the program. $305 million is set aside for territories. The set aside that would have been provided for tribal nations is instead passed through the HASDA programs rather than through this treasury-based program, with the idea of making sure that they have more flexibility for using their resources. Under the bill, there's a lot of provisions that are identical or very similar to the $25 billion that passed last December, but I just want to point out a couple of items there. One, the same requirement is in place about prioritizing households below 50% of AMI. That's a really important criteria that was carried over. One of the changes we saw is some less restrictive language around eligibility. In the past bill, households had to show that they had a financial hardship that was due directly or indirectly to the pandemic. Under this bill, that's eased a little bit by requiring households to show that they are experiencing a hardship during or due to the pandemic. So that during element will make it a lot easier for households to meet that criteria. Another major difference is that the funds can be used to provide longer term assistance. Under the December bill, assistance can only be provided for up to 15 months. Under this bill, assistance can be provided for 18 months. So a little bit more generous on that end. The other important factor here that folks will be interested in to know is that while there are really strict limitations about what Congress can do through a budget reconciliation bill, one of the things that we were pleased to see was that they made a statutory change to the deadline for spending the initial tranche of $25 billion. So you might recall that under last year's budget, the deadline was end of the year of 2021. That deadline would be extended under this bill to 2022. And then this tranche of funding has a lot more generous time frame for spending down the funds until 2025. In addition to emergency rental assistance, there's also significant funds for housing vouchers. So the bill provides $5 billion for this purpose. We're really glad to start to see this as well because it gives an eye towards the longer term housing stability resources that are needed. The funds, again, are targeted to households that are experiencing or at risk of homelessness, who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, or who were recently experiencing homelessness and for whom rental assistance would help prevent them from becoming homeless again. The resources are going to be allocated to public housing authorities within 60 days. And for a short period of time until 2023, or relatively short, households can reissue these vouchers to new households in need. But after that time period, the PHA will not be able to reissue to new households, which means that the housing vouchers sunset after a certain period of time. I'll also just quickly mention that there's other funds available for homeowner assistance, about $10 billion. Some of that, 39 million, goes through USDA's Section 502 and 504 programs. There's also $100 million for housing counseling and $5 billion for utility and water assistance, mostly through the LIHEAP program, although that is a piece of another bill that's worked its way through another committee. And with that, I think I answered the questions that you raised, Diane, but I'll turn it back to you. I'll also share in the chat box the link to our fact sheet where people can find more information about what's in the bill.
Sarah, thanks for that. Can you also touch on the eviction moratorium and why it's unlikely to be in this COVID package and what that means for our advocacy?
Yeah, thanks for raising that again. Because Congress is using a budget reconciliation process, there are really strict limitations on what can be moved that way. So as we all have discussed, the budget reconciliation process allows Congress to pass bills in the Senate with just a simple majority rather than 60 votes. But in trade-off, they can only do this for bills that have a direct budgetary impact. And because the eviction moratorium is a policy change, it does not have a budgetary impact. We will not be able to get an extension or improvements to the eviction moratorium in a COVID relief package. That makes all of our advocacy around strengthening the eviction moratorium even more important and putting pressure on the administration to make those changes, because there isn't a legislative opportunity to do that. Thanks,
Great,
Diane.
thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so just a reminder again to everybody that we'll be recirculating the letter to the Biden administration urging that they extend, enforce, and strengthen the CDC eviction moratorium. So please look out for that and help us get as many signatures as possible, because as Sarah said, it's very unlikely, nearly impossible for the next COVID package to include that really urgently needed protection for tenants. So we need to have as strong a showing as possible in urging the Biden administration to take that action themselves. And Sarah, there's another question. Oh, can you just reiterate the tribal housing funding in the COVID relief package?
Yeah, happy to do that. So under the formula that congressional staffers were looking at for emergency rental assistance, tribal nations would have received about $750 million, rather than setting that aside through the ERA program. They decided to set that to provide that to tribal nations through the NAHASDA programs at HUD. So that's the Native American Housing Block Grants, Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grants, and Indian Community Development Block Grant programs.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So that's all the questions and that's all the speakers for today. So just a reminder to everybody that things will move very quickly now on the next COVID relief package. As Sarah said, Congress is aiming to get a next COVID package enacted by mid-March, because that's when the current extended unemployment insurance benefits expire. So that is a month from now. And during that time, we will see the House vote on the bill likely next week, and then action in the Senate, but directly on the Senate floor, no action in committees. So we have a real opportunity and a real possibility of getting this $40 billion in funds for renters, people who are homeless, and homeowners enacted quickly. So please continue to make the case to your members of Congress for why these resources are so badly needed and why they're needed quickly. And then we will pivot, and we will pivot our advocacy, and we will pivot the work of this network to the long-term solutions that we know are needed to address the underlying structural, long-term, pervasive issues that led to this eviction crisis in the first place. So much more to come on advocacy for the long-term change we need as well. And a reminder on, if you know about new emergency rental assistance programs opening, please always feel free to reach out to us and let us know about that. If you are aware of problems with state and local administration of programs, whether because of the current Treasury FAQ or for other reasons, We always want to hear about that as well. So please reach out, and always feel free to join any of the working group calls that we have in between these national calls. Those working group and smaller calls include our state and local implementation calls on working with FEMA, and Tenant Talk Live, and our policy working group calls. So you can find more information on our website on how to sign up for all of those, and we'll include, Elena just put the link in the chat, thank you. And we'll include that in the follow-up email that you should all receive too. And one last time, a heads up to look out tomorrow for the recirculation of the sign-on letter for the Biden administration to extend, strengthen, and enforce the eviction moratorium. And thanks in advance for your help in getting it out widely. So thank you all. Again, stay safe and warm if you're in a place that's extraordinarily cold. And I appreciate all of your good work and advocacy, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks. Bye.